First part, I want to talk about some of the minutiae of ordering and just some little things if you are planning on building the moon board and ordering all the parts you can from Moon themselves. So first of all, you have the option of a whole freestanding kit, just the components that you then build yourself, or just buying all the holds. And I just bought all the holds. Now I'll tell you why. So I wanted the 2019 setup, and it's expensive, but the shipping is actually what killed it. So if you order the panels, the shipping goes up like $600 or something like that. I don't remember the exact number, but it was pretty crazy. So if you do order the whole panel system, shipping to the US is super expensive. So if you're in the United States, then you probably don't want to buy the panels. The panels are $1,000 on their own. That's actually not terrible considering the amount of work it takes to set up the panels and use a good quality ply. So I was considering it, but with that extra shipping, it was just like, no, that's probably not. So getting into the different things that you can do when ordering, you can choose whatever hold sets you need to. If you do buy the original school holds, you do not need to buy the footholds. So that was something that I made a mistake on. So I have some extra footholds in my order. It says it has this 10 standard Moonboard footholds here, so you don't need to go and buy the footholds separately. So that is one way of saving a little bit of money, but I made that mistake. So you might not want to do that. Each of the bolts kits goes with a certain set of holds. And so when you do order the bolts, there are different sizes and they go and correspond with different holds. So when you do get them and you are installing them, I would actually go ahead and put the bolts with the holds before you go and start installing them. I found there's a couple that are a little sketchy because they weren't long enough, and maybe it would have been better if I had done this right at the beginning. By the end I figured this out, that I should match up the bolts to the holds before I install them, but even doing the best I could, I found a few that I would rather have some of the longer bolts that come with them. The bolts and the T-nuts are all pretty good priced, so you might as well just get them from Moon if you are ordering. So far, if you're thinking about the screw-on footholds, I have actually not found a single problem yet that uses them, at least on the 2019 setup. So far that has been a waste of money, and I didn't even install them. Now, if you do buy the T-nuts, I did buy the metric stuff just because I was like, hey, why not? The whole thing is sort of a metric system. It doesn't really make a difference in the end if you don't care about compatibility with an existing system, but if you are using standard stuff in the US, you should probably just get the US standard or imperial ones. Now, one thing also that I wish I knew when I bought these, they don't come with the set screws. So if you do order them from a lot of other climbing places, they do come with set screws. So if you don't, then you should probably go ahead and make sure that you're keeping that in mind of what you need for your set screws. So it says that they require 2 small mounting screws, but I assume that meant that they would use them and ship them with them, but they don't, so you have to buy your own. So I think I bought some 5/8 inch number 6 screws. If you're in the US, that's just the way they number them, is numbers for their thickness, and then their length is by their length in inches. And so that worked pretty well with those, and I'll show a picture of that later. So I think that was it. One thing you do need to also keep in mind is that when you do go and order this, you will have to pay some taxes from FedEx after they ship it to you. So you'll get your package of stuff, and then you'll get a bill from FedEx for import duties and stuff like that. So for me, like, I ordered, just all the holds and then the LED system as well. And so it was over $2,000, and then there's about $100 of extra tax on top of that to pay from FedEx. So just keep that in mind when you're ordering as well. And shipping does take a long time, although they overnight it. So it's like you wait 8 weeks and then you get an overnighted package from Moon. So that's kind of cool, but with the wait times that are going on right now, it won't help that much that it will be overnighted to you. Alright, so let me move on. DIY build instructions from Moon themselves. And while you're planning, you're probably going to use this as one of your main resources. This is sort of designed to help with the pre-built panels that they are selling, as you can see here. But there are a couple things here that would have helped me if I had known better before I built mine. So like the main thing everyone's going to look up right now when they're starting to build their Moonboard is like things about framing it. And so when you look on framing websites, you'll see them all recommend things like 16-inch on center stud spacing or 24 or whatever it will be depending on where you live. And so Moon recommends this 32-inch stud spacing, which is 813 millimeters. So in the standard construction lingo, it tends to say something like 16-inch on centers, and that will mean like they'll measure from this edge to the center of the next stud at 16 inches, in this case 32 inches, and then to the next center will be 32, and this is a very narrow board, but then it'll not be 32 inches between the studs. So I really don't like this picture in that the stud spaces, like these lines, the dimensioning lines, go between the studs and say 32 inches. That's not how it should be. It's 32, 32, 32, and that makes 96 inches. So these lines really should extend all the way to the edge of the stud. And so you have to keep that in mind when you're building yours. Also, I found if you do 32-inch on centers, then you get in the way of the bolt holes. So like the one bolt is supposed to be at 800 millimeters. And so if you do this to the center of this, then one of the bolts pretty much lines up exactly with being on top of the stud. So I see this mistake with lots of other woodies, but I assumed that these instructions were fine, and I didn't think ahead on my build at all, just because I was doing just one piece at a time, kind of chunking it into just little manageable parts so I didn't overwhelm my brain. But I should have paid attention to that and understood that that's a bad idea. So luckily I caught it before I drilled out my panels, but I had to basically move my bolt holes 20 millimeters or 2 centimeters over. So my entire setup is just moved over to the left a little bit by 2 centimeters, both on the kickboard and on the main panels. So the measurements on mine are all exactly the same. It's just that everything's moved over by 2 centimeters, and that's to avoid hitting the stud. And that was really annoying. So if you're building your own, I would say that's like a huge thing, is to pre-plan and think about the holes when you're doing your stud spacing. Like in the US, like a standard wall that's built really well will be something like 2x6 or 2x8 pieces of wood, and it'll be spaced at 16 inches. I haven't done the calculations for a 16-inch one of where there might be like bolt holes for right here, but that means you'd have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 studs here, and that just doesn't leave you any room to make mistakes with the bolt holes, and so you don't want to have the bolts end up right where a stud is. So just keep that in mind. if I were to do it again, I probably would have kept this 32-inch spacing, but I would do it edge to edge. So from this edge to the edge of this would be 32 inches, and that would leave a little wiggle room. It might even still be a little too close because the T-nuts themselves are quite wide. There may be like 30 millimeters wide in diameter, so that might still end up with the like flange of the T-nut overlapping the stud. So just something you should think about as you're designing it, and not by the end of your build like I did it. Alright, so one of the last things I want to talk about is the lumber quality. So this is something I had no idea of when I started this. I know nothing about construction. But wood is graded in different qualities, and then like those grades mean different things about the wood itself, and how strong it is, as well as just like things you're gonna have to deal with it. So both the lumber as well as like the plywood, there's different considerations. So generally, if you go to Home Depot or any like home improvement store, you're gonna find like number 2 or better lumber. So for most people that'll be 2x4s or 2x6s or 2x8s. These are not the actual sizes, like it's not 2 inches by 6 inches. It's 1.5 inches by 3.5 inches, and then this is 1.5 inches by 5.5 inches, and then the 2x8s are 1.5 by 7.5 inches. So that's not about the quality, but just the measurements that you should know, so that when you are laying out your framing and stuff, you know to subtract the right amount when you're doing it. But anyway, so the number 2 or better generally means like you'll get a piece of wood and it's going to have knots in it. So knots are like where there are branches and stuff like that. Generally, what I found was like these will look and be perfectly straight. Like this is like a view from the side when you go ahead and like buy them right at the store, but that doesn't always stay that way. So these knots, as well as like the grain and stuff that you get, and the fact that the wood that you order is going to be pretty wet when you get it. So either you should use it like right away, like within a day or two, or else as it starts to dry, that wood is going to do a few different things. So like the whole board, if we look at it from like the side, is gonna like bow a little bit. Like that tends to be super common. Also like sometimes from like the other view, they can cup. It'll go kind of like that. It'll also like from the side view start to sort of go up and down that way, and that's like called crowning. And then also it can, like if I'm looking at this from the side, like you might start to see the ends are kind of cockeyed, so it starts to twist. So one side goes that way and the other side kind of goes that way. So I just bought extra wood because why not, and I let it dry because I was slow at building this, and so some of the wood did do these things. So like I said, either use it right away or buy extra so that you can use the best pieces after they start to warp. And I'm pretty sure you can even return the wood that warps. I haven't done it just because I can still use a lot of these pieces by like cutting them up into smaller stuff and using them for other projects. So it's not like the end of the world, but it is something that happens. Another thing you could do is to buy like either number 1 or select, not about plywood, but grade wood. And so that wood tends to have either no knots or just like really small ones. And at least I did buy my 4x4s in this like select grade. They were basically 4 times as expensive. So like everything else was like less than $1 per foot, and these were about $4 per foot. So definitely more expensive, but the wood itself was really nice. And so it didn't warp or anything like that on me. It stayed nice and straight, and like it just is nicer looking wood. So that's something you could look into if you want to spend more money and deal with less headaches of like the number 2 quality. I think that's about it. Oh, and if you need to be doing this outdoors or having ground contact, then you will need to buy pressure treated lumber. Pressure treated lumber, they basically like throw in a bunch of chemicals, and you'll see it looks like a different color, like brown or green, and there's a bunch of little stippling in it. And supposedly this stuff's not good for your lungs or anything, so if you're cutting it you want to wear a mask and stuff. But this is for like outdoor builds, and I didn't need that, so I didn't worry about it. But if you are building it outdoors, you will need to look into this stuff, and I have no idea if it relates to any of those other things. Alright, so the last thing to talk about with the wood stuff is plywood quality. So you're going to need basically 4 sheets of 4 by 8 plywood. Usually it's recommended 3/4 of an inch thick. If you just go to the store and say I need 4/8 inch, or 4 by 8 sheet of plywood, 3/4 inch thick, there's like 20 options for what you can get with that. You can get really cheap stuff, you can get really expensive stuff. So like your cost range can be something like $20 to like $140 for like a maple plywood or something like that, and probably even higher than that if you want something really fancy. So I decided to get good, like quite good plywood. So I got 3/4 inch Baltic birch from it was a hardwood store that sells also specialty plywood. And what's cool about it is just like it is just perfect. Like the plies like are all even, they're all like nice quality. There's either very little knots or no knots, or if there are some knots, they like fill them in with another piece of birch, and so you don't even see them. It's just like a really nice piece of plywood. It's very strong. When you do like screw into it, like from your T-nuts and stuff like that, it works quite well. It's just like solid, it feels good. In my other wall, the vertical traverse wall, I actually had quite a few other types of plywood in there. So like I was just using scrap that we had leftovers of things in the house, and so I had some like 5/8 inch just like low quality plywood, and that stuff was basically like 4 layers. Like this is 12 layers. This was 4 layers. It had bunches of like knots in it. It had voids, which are basically like empty places in it, and it was like a lot weaker. So like the finish was also like really rough. So this stuff, like you get what you pay for. It'll work, like it works fine, but it's just not super high quality. And then there's things that are like, at least the hardwood store told me they're called like shop hardwood plywood. It's basically what they call like a veneer. So like that means like we got like a, let's say it's a birch one, so like it says birch, and you'll find this one will be something like $50 a sheet at Home Depot. And so this stuff actually has like on the very top it has this tiny thin veneer. I don't even veneer on the top and on the bottom. It's very smooth, but it's like, you know, 1/64 inch thick. So it's really thin, and then like the inside is just kind of like normal plywood. It's okay quality and everything. Was fine. I'd say this is like a good middle ground if you don't want to go with the Baltic birch. This stuff actually was, I think it was like $76 a sheet, so more expensive. This stuff was pretty good. It has a nice finish, so it painted really well. The only problem with it is like when you cut it or drill it, this thin veneer like sends up these like super sharp little razor splinters, and those can be a pain, and they can like really be annoying if you touch them with bare hands before you sand it. So like this stuff took more sanding before it was like handleable by hand. So I'm glad for my like Moonboard, since it was overhanging and stuff, that I got this stuff. It's also just nice to work with, but it is a little bit more expensive. Alright, so just to talk about basic tools that I used, mostly just basic stuff with a couple specialty things. So most of the stuff I had already. Of course you want to have some personal protective equipment. You should always be using that when you're using power tools and other things like that. Shouldn't be using gloves with saws just because they can catch, but you know, basic shop safety stuff. Tons of the work was done with just these three things. So measuring was super important, marking is really important. The speed square, I think they call it, was really handy for just keeping everything nice and parallel or perpendicular. I did pick up a chalk line to do all the T-nut and stuff like that. I did actually buy a new measuring tape, so this is both in imperial and in metric, so that's kind of nice. So I was able to, you know, reference both what it is in the, you know, inches and feet as well as in centimeters, and since a lot of the specs are actually a lot easier to work with centimeters, then this was really nice to have. And then just imperial is always nice to have in the US for reasons. I did have a skill saw or a circular saw, really handy for cutting. I could see this being done with just a hand saw, but this made everything nice and easy. And then most of the work was done with the drill. I do have an impact driver, but this is not necessary at all. It's just kind of nice. It's very easy to drive in the screws and stuff with that. I did use a random orbital sander, so that's just really nice. A couple different grits, some for just the finishing and other coarse ones for smoothing things over. I did actually buy 2 new drill bits, so most of my hardware is 3/8 inch bolts. So I used a lot of 3/8 inch bolts, and sometimes at a depth of something like 7 inches. So I bought a 12 inch bit, so that was actually really handy. And then I did buy this 15/32 bit, which is about a 12 millimeter, and the T-nuts were drilled with this one. So I found that 1/2 inch was just a little bit too loose and had a lot of play in it. 7/16 was too tight and I couldn't get the T-nuts in. So for Moon, their specs call for 12 millimeter. This is 11.9, so this works just fine. Just have to ream it out just a tiny bit or hammer them in just a little bit to get it to fit nicely. Besides that, I do have some bits. There's also just a whole bunch. I bought these construction screws, so these are really nice. This is the first time I ever bought these and have seen these, but they're Torx drive, and they're self-tapping, and they're also rated for exterior use, and these are just super handy. And I've just bought a whole bunch in different sizes, so 1.5, 2 inch, 2.5, 3.5, 4 inch. And I did talk about these little screws for the T-nuts also. For me, I did do a little bit of putting stuff into the concrete, so I did get some concrete screws. These are interesting. I've never heard of these before either before I started building this, but I did anchor some of the wood into the concrete just to stabilize everything. But that's pretty much it in terms of tool usage. I did actually use some chisels occasionally because, like I said, I had trouble with T-nut spacing and I had to notch things out a little bit just to keep the tolerances wide and so that there wouldn't be anything rubbing or anything like that. Paddle bits are really nice if you have the chance. You know, these make it easier to drill clean holes, so I wish I could have found a 15-30 seconds in one of these styles, but I couldn't, so I just used a regular style, but it had a little bit more blowout from that. Since I did use bolts, having some wrenches is nice to tighten up the bolts. And then, let's see, oh yeah, and then just like a hammer is occasionally useful for hammering stuff into place. But that's pretty much it. That's all you really need for building the Moonboard, and paint and stuff like that if you are so inclined. Oh, and just a couple little tips for if you do get the LED system. So your blocking that you're going to use between the studs may interfere a little bit with your wiring, and so you do have to kind of drill those out because there are ones right at the joint between the plywood. Some of my holes are very close to the stud, and so like I had some screws going in from the other side of the stud into this block, and so I had to make sure I didn't hit those screws. I actually did hit the screws a couple times, so you can see this one is higher than this one because I had to drill at an angle to avoid the screws that were in there, and I had to resharpen my drill bit because of that, so that was annoying. Also, you will have to either notch or drill out holes to go between the rows, and this is super annoying because you have to pull the wires through and pull all the LEDs that go after it from there. And so doing something like this where every row has to go inside one of those holes and then you have to pull it through, super freaking annoying. So you may want to consider doing your blocking plates just flat like this. So I did that on the sides, and then the center was vertical, but it was super annoying to pull through all of the LED cables because of that. Besides that, the wiring and everything was really easy. The written instructions say that there's going to be one extra LED, but if you look at mine, there's two, and on the buying website it does say there's two extras, so if you end up with two extras, that's probably correct. I was really worried that I missed a hole, but there's really not that much extra tension or extra wire in between these, so you don't have a lot of room. Like, it could not just go over the 2x6. There just wasn't enough room to do that, so just something to keep in mind if you are going to do the LED system.